All right, everybody, welcome to this discussion, Jew-created Christian heresies through the centuries. When I say Jew-created, I'm talking primarily about the third faction. Third faction meaning, of course, their little secret societies, infiltrating, corrupting. Um, Before I even begin this discussion, let me remind you that Christianity itself was created by the third faction. It was originally nothing more than an insurrectionist movement. It just so happens that one of those insurrectionist movements grew beyond what they had intended and became popular among Gentiles and is still with us today, called Christianity. Today, Christianity, though, is nothing like what its founder had created it to be. Nor is it anything like what it was just 100, 150 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 800 years ago, or 1,000. It has mutated again and again and again and again and again. The leaders thereof, the Jewish leaders, 99% of the time, it's just Jewish leaders. There have been some branch offs that have been entirely Gentile created, but for the most part, every branch thereof has been created by a new generation of Jewish manipulators who have used the religion and continue to use it in directions that suit their interests, like, Christian Zionism. Obviously. That is as Jewish as you can get. But, there's been other branches that have pulled, Christian masses this direction, that direction, all over the frickin' map. But we want to look at some specific examples because you can really see the third faction's hand in these and what they were trying to accomplish. But do remember when I talked about, the Apostle Paul? Paul, although a third factioner himself, along with Josephus that he worked with, maybe Paul was Josephus. There's a good deal of evidence for that. But they at least knew each other because they went to the same Pharisaical school at the same time, lived in Jerusalem in the first century, or in Judea. Anyway, Paul, though, a third factioner, kind of took things into, new realms that his third faction buddies didn't even intend. They weren't too happy with it. But as time went on, some of them saw the wisdom in it. Well, yeah, I guess this is a good idea. It is working quite well. We are able to manipulate a lot of Gentiles. So, a lot of them went along with it, but there were still some that didn't like it, never did, never will. In any case, it's interesting to look from the early centuries on at various Christian heresies that came about, many of them which were blatantly Jewish, right? The third faction was mixing a lot of Judaism in, trying to win over the Gentile converts of this new religion more to the Jewish side because they saw that it had become Gentilized so much that they weren't allies with Jews anymore. So they had to make it more Jewish, bring them back into balance. So it's pretty interesting to take a look at this. So that's what we're going to be doing here. And the first one we're going to look at, it was the first major, quote, heresy, was Gnosticism. I've had a lot of people ask me over the years, what about Gnosticism? Because if you look at what the Gnostics taught, it sounds good, right? Sure, that's how the third faction works. When they introduced the Reformation, they brought a lot of good points out because they were waging war against the priestly line that was, more powerful than the other two, right? The Vatican overawed the power of the kings and emperors, the Jewish royal bloodline. And the third faction was overawed to a large degree early on by the Vatican. So the other two factions didn't like this. They often teamed up against the Vatican. But that worked the other way around, too. Once the Vatican and at least some kings realized, hey, the third faction is a threat to our power, they teamed up against the third faction. It's interesting to, look at how this played out You can see all the infighting that was going on. Only if Gentiles had realized this, they could have played them against each other like they like to do with us, and we could have taken them down that way. But anyway, so Gnosticism was the first major Jewish introduced heresy. And even though it had some good ideas, right? You know, I brought out how the Renaissance was another third faction creation, this time using science and getting people to turn their back. If religion didn't work, getting Protestantism to see how evil the Catholic Church was, then they figured, okay, the Renaissance will do it for those that are more scientifically minded. And so they brought out a lot of things that were true so that people could confirm them for themselves and see that, yes, the church has been lying. Science is totally contrary to what the church teaches, or vice versa. You know, what the church teaches contradicts science, so the church is wrong. It worked brilliantly. And so that's what was going on with Gnosticism early on. Gnosticism is a very sensible, in a lot of ways, it's a very sensible ideology, right? It argued, for example, that Yahweh was an evil, monstrous son of a bitch. And he is, isn't he? And so they figured, this will appeal to a lot of Christians. They're newly converted to this Jewish branch religion. If we can get them to see how evil the Jewish God is, we can bring them around to our side. Ultimately, third faction thinking, right? Occultism, and, replace Christianity with that. But selling it to them as a Christian religion, but just denouncing Yahweh. It's interesting. There's a lot of dupes who fall for that today. They still embrace Christianity with one hand and the idea that you can denounce Yahweh. They clearly can see Yahweh is evil. They look at the Old Testament. Of course, Yahweh's evil in the New Testament as well, but it's tempered down a lot more. Nevertheless, though, it's the same fucking God. So Christians today are still falling for Gnosticism, or at least the Gnostic idea, that you can embrace Christianity while denouncing Yahweh as evil. No, the fuck you can't. If you're going to recognize that Yahweh is evil, you have to, unless you want to live in a fucking fantasy world. Of course, you're living in a fantasy world anyway, if you endorse Christianity in any form, but you know what I'm saying. You're going to be in a fantasy world convincing yourself that, you can still embrace Christianity while denouncing Yahweh as evil. Yahweh is the God of Christianity. Of course he is. That is the most pathetic form of Christian apologetics that you could possibly conceive of. That you can denounce the entire Old Testament, including the Old Testament God, and think that you can still embrace Christianity, when the Old Testament and the Old Testament God are the very fucking foundation of Christianity. Every time Christ referred to the scriptures, he's talking about the Old Testament. Every time Christ talked about his dada, he's talking about Yahweh. His God is Yahweh. God fucking damn it. That doesn't even require elaboration. It's a fucking fact. And if you can't see that, there's some people who have been commenting in my videos that have been listening to me, some of them for years. And I just discovered recently that they endorse this idea. Are you fucking kidding? Have you not listened to my early videos on this channel? My first 100 or so videos? That's all I do, is expose that Bible as the fraud that it is and show that the God of the New Testament is, in fact, undeniably, incontestably the God of the Old Testament. Knock it off. It's fucking ridiculous. But this is what the Gnostics were doing. They infiltrated Christianity. It was a Jewish creation, Gnosticism. Third faction, Jewish creation. They were infiltrating Christianity and teaching this very idea that Yahweh is evil. They're right, he is evil. But trying to marry that idea with Christianity, you can't do it. It just shows how gullible people were back then and how gullible they are today to fall for that kind of horse shit. It's third faction Judaism is what it is. That's all Gnosticism is. So anyways, Gnosticism came around very early in the Christian church history. It was really fully up and running by just the second century, but it was already developing in the first century because the third faction, looking on from Egypt, where it was headquartered, was seeing that this Pauline movement was catching on with a lot of Gentiles, and they didn't like uh, some of the directions where it was going. And they didn't like that it was already at that early stage starting to take on more of a Gentile connotation to it. They didn't want that. They liked the idea that Gentiles could be manipulated, but not if it was becoming too Gentilized. They wanted to keep it more Jewish, leaning more in the Jewish direction. Paul was going too far overboard, denouncing everything that was Jewish, right? Circumcision. Even though Paul himself was still a full Jew, he was going a little too far with it to make it more appealing to the Gentiles, but it wasn't to the liking of the third faction. So that's why they were introducing Gnosticism. Gnosticism is considered one of the worst, if not the worst, heretical movements in the early Christian church by, the Catholic Church, for example. If you look in the Catholic Encyclopedia, they'll cite Gnosticism. But even worse than that, though, the prize winner would be Arianism, the great heretic that taught that Jesus was not God, when in fact the fucking Gospels don't teach that he was God. The entire New Testament don't teach he was God. I've already covered that a while back. The New Testament